Welcome to Home Education Matters, the weekly podcast supporting you on your home education journey. Hello and welcome to Home Education Matters podcast. Today I am very pleased to be joined by Anna Martin, and we are going to be talking about Latin and Greek. Studying Latin and Greek as home educators. Now, this is, as soon as I saw Anna pop up on one of my Facebook groups, I went straight onto the comments and I was like, come on the podcast, because these are really interesting subjects. So first of all, welcome to the podcast, Anna, and do tell us a little bit about yourself and how you relate to the home education community and all that kind of stuff.
So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about myself. You will have noticed from my accent that I'm not originally from the UK. I studied in Barcelona when I was growing up. So I had a bilingual education from a very young age, which was great. I studied classics. And then when I finished my degree, I really didn't want to stay put where I was. So I traveled a lot. I went around the world teaching languages, later on teaching scuba diving, and eventually life took me to the UK, where I now work. I've been living here for, I think it's been 14 years now, so it's been quite a long time. I live in London, and luckily, now that everything is online, I'm able again to work with people from around the world, from my top office. So I teach students from different countries. Some of them are homeschooled. Some of them study in a school, but their school doesn't offer the subjects they want to learn. So I offer them outside of school.
So you don't just teach Latin and Greek. Do you teach kind of MFL kind of style as well?
Oh, no. The subjects I meant Latin and Greek, generally.
Okay, but you're
sometimes
bilingual because your English is amazing.
When I finished my degree, I actually started teaching briefly classics, and then I wanted to focus on my German and my English because I spent some time in Germany when I was studying as well. So I've been, when I was younger, teaching English, Spanish, and French, a lot of Spanish, by the way, because we have a lot of visitors coming to Barcelona to learn Spanish. And then later on in life, I've gone back to my roots of teaching Latin and Greek. But if I have a student who wants to do both Latin and Spanish, I always take that on because I think it's very exciting to do both languages at the same time.
It must be quite different teaching Latin and Greek to teaching French and Spanish.
Well, that is what you would think. And that's what I thought when I started. And one of the reasons probably why I stopped teaching Latin and Greek initially, because it was a very different way of learning. And it could be very demotivating for lots of students because you had to focus a lot on the grammar and the translation skills and accuracy and making sure you put your ending right there with precision. And at some point I was like, well, I am the same teacher when I'm the same person when I teach Latin and when I teach Spanish. We're having a lot of fun when I'm teaching Spanish, everyone. When I'm teaching Latin, some students are having a lot of fun because they enjoy the challenge. Other students are having a terrible time. They have fun because we're doing activities, but they're struggling. So as a result, I started bringing some of the philosophy of my Spanish lessons into my Latin teaching. I saw it worked. And in fact, now when I teach, I use a lot of singing, speaking. So I develop all 4 skills in my Latin lessons as I do in my Spanish lessons. Materials are still not the same. Exams are still not the same, but I try as best as I can to make it a language learning experience, like an immersive experience.
Yeah, because I'm guessing that for the exams, Latin and Greek are very written based, reading and writing based, whereas for Spanish and French, it's based on the 4, like the quartet, right?
Exactly.
The speaking, listening, reading, writing. Now, so it's interesting that you said that you found you were teaching Latin in one way and Spanish in another, because that is my perception of language learning. My perception is that because they're dead languages, in inverted commas, that you focus on the reading and the writing because there's no one to speak to. So you're not practicing that element so much.
But there is, if you want to. There is, like, for example, if you have a teacher like me, you can speak to your teacher, you can speak to the people in your class. And increasingly, there's a world community of people online who meet up and speak Latin and even meet in person and speak Latin. So we're bringing it back. It was difficult 20 years ago. It's not difficult today. Because 20 years ago, you had to rely on the media, say the French TV or the Spanish newspapers or Spanish radio. But nowadays, anyone can produce anywhere. And there's lots of very, very eloquent and fluent Latin speakers producing materials. There's a little bit of a renaissance at the moment in Latin studies. So we have new books coming out every week. It's very exciting.
So it's like a kind of niche community. So
niche.
For example, I live in South Wales, and where I live there's a lot of Welsh speakers, and Welsh has had such a resurgence, and now you hear it all around you. And I'm wondering, is it the same kind of thing with Latin, where you join Facebook groups and then you recommend podcasts to each other? Oh really? How amazing. So there's a bunch of people in the world talking Latin to each other.
Yes, we're all there, sitting there, talking to each other, writing messages to each other in Latin, writing little books. I've published a little Catalan story in Latin. So my first language is Catalan, together with Spanish. I'm bilingual. And Catalan is a bit like Welsh. It's had difficulties. It's in a bit of a more difficult situation than Welsh probably at the moment, in the sense of the direction it's going. I think Welsh, they've managed to revitalize it really well recently. I can see a very positive change. Catalan,
I don't
so
know.
much.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know a lot about that, but I'm guessing that politics plays a part in that as well, does it?
Yes, indeed, it does. Yes. The beauty about Latin is that you obviously can make it political, but we don't have any associations with any countries other than the Vatican. So it's very international. It's a truly lingua franca, but it was...
So it's like Esperanto. Maybe we should have all just ditched off Esperanto and all learnt Latin as our universal language.
Indeed, yes.
That would be quite cool. I've got a question for you about Latin and this idea that you're all in this community chatting together in Latin, which I just love the idea of, right? I read something interesting, like about a year ago, that said that we don't know how Latin was pronounced, and the only way we can find out is by reading poetry and trying to guess like how it scans and what it rhymes with. Is that true? And how do you go about pronunciation if we have no actual audios of how it was spoken?
I love that you're asking me this question. I love talking about this. We do have ways of knowing how they spoke. We don't have recordings, so we don't have 100% proof of exactly how they spoke. However, you've mentioned the poetry. We do have the poetry. If they're telling us that here there's a rhetorical effect by a repetition of certain sounds, then you know those sounds are sounding similar, for example. But it's not only that. We also have spelling mistakes. When people start making spelling mistakes, it's because the pronunciation is changing. So they are very, very revealing spelling mistakes. We also have the ability to reconstruct what spoken language actually was like, as opposed to written language, from the changes that took place into the different Romance languages. So if you look at Spanish, you can see there reflected the short and the long vowels that we had in Latin, and it can give you an idea of where it may come from. So if you study general linguistics and universal linguistics, and you take a look at how languages generally change and what processes are possible, you can reconstruct quite a lot of those processes with Latin. An example, words that have moved into German, depending on when they have been adopted into the language, they have been adopted with one pronunciation or another. So that gives us an idea of how people were saying the word at the time. Historical linguistics is a fascinating world with plenty to discover still left. So
it sounds like you'd have to be a kind of detective, you know.
It's a bit of it's similar to detective work sometimes, and sometimes you just do a reconstruction, and later on documents appear and show that it was a correct reconstruction. That's exactly what people were saying at the time. So yeah.
So if we take Latin as an example, you're clearly able to approach it in a similar way to Spanish or French, in that you see it as an alive language that you can communicate with, and it's almost like a kind of secret code between a group of people that know Latin. I mean, my son would be all over this as a theory because he's a big cipher code person, and anything that not many people do, he loves that, right? So so you approach it in that way. Now, obviously, as we were talking about at the start, the exams are different. So how
They are.
do you teach anybody that just wants to learn Latin for the fun of learning Latin? Or do you invariably, like 95% of the time, teach to the exam? And how do you then reconcile that with your more fun, boisterous approach?
I teach both. Sometimes people come to me and say, I just want to learn Latin. And this is like somebody who wants to do ballet but doesn't want to be a professional ballerina, for example. Other times they come to me and say, well, I want to learn Latin and also I need a 9 in my GCSE. And obviously I cannot change the exam. I need to prepare them for the exam. However, there is no clash between spending time speaking the language, listening to the language, and modifying the language. There is no clash between that and doing well in an exam. In fact, I would argue, in order to really acquire a language and really understand how it works, you need to be able to use it actively. So obviously there will be more learning of the literature that you will not have in a Spanish and a French exam, for example, or a German exam, because it's all contemporary texts and very adapted. In Latin, you have the literature side of things where you're like dealing with a text that contemporary Romans 2000 years ago would have struggled with because it was highly literary and it used very complex intertext and archaisms, etc. But it's not impossible to bring little bits of of a language that is alive into studying a text that it's a bit dead. Like so poetry can look sometimes until you start scratching the surface and then it all comes alive again.
So when it comes to the exam, there's 2 questions I have for you. The first one is, how many exam boards offer it? And is there much difference between the syllabus? And is there a syllabus that you particularly like, an exam specification you like? And my second question is, when you are, in fact, let me think about what my second question is.
Should I answer the first question?
Answer the first question. I'll think of my second question.
In the UK, most schools will do the OCR exam. That's, I can't give you the percentage because I don't know, but that's most schools, particularly private schools. There is also the EDUCAS exam. It's very popular and I think it allows a bit more room for those who don't have a lot of time to prepare for the exam. I don't specialize in EDUCAS. I specialize in OCR. So
EDUCAS, you mean EdXL and AQA kind of things, right? Because EDUCAS covers those, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the AQA one.
Mm-hmm.
Internationally, you also have the international GCSE. That one is very similar to the OCR one. And those are the 2 I teach regularly.
So you have Cambridge International IGCSE, Cambridge IGCSE,
yes.
and OCR, just standard GCSE.
Yes,
and they're quite
then
similar.
You have the EDUCAS one, which I don't teach, so I can't give you. I wouldn't be able to give you a lot of information about it because I generally don't work with it.
So the 2 that you know, they're reasonably similar, are they? Because sometimes IGCSEs and GCSEs are quite different in content, but not so with Latin.
They're not that different in content. There's differences when you explain where the marks come from once you're giving your answers and what you need to be most careful with. But the exam itself is not very different at all, no.
Okay. And that brings me on to my second question that I've joyfully remembered, which was, you mentioned that there's a literature element. So would I be right in thinking that for Latin, you need to do the usual reading and writing? Here's a passage, translate that to English or answer questions about it or whatever.
Yes.
But there's also a section where you're actually reading classical literature.
The beautiful section.
Yeah. And now who are the authors? Who are the authors they use for that?
You can choose. Your teacher has a choice or the student has a choice. I generally allow my students some room for choice, but I influence them if I think they're going to like one thing more than the other. We can talk about it. But yes, there is a choice. They're real authors. Generally, some of them are adapted, some of them are not adapted. I like to do the Virgil unadapted one, and I like to do the Cambridge Latin Anthology in adapted version for the prose. So you do some Tacitus, for example, or some Apuleius that has been adapted but has the flavor of the original still in there. So only a few things have been removed or changed. And then you have Virgil, which is the real Virgil. And to me, that is such a selling point for students when I explain to them, this is not like any other foreign language where you're going to learn how to get your tickets to go to the cinema or explain what you like to do at the weekend with your friends. You actually get to engage with a text that was written 2,000 years ago.
And what sort of questions are they asked? Are they asked English literature style questions?
Yes,
or is it comprehension
absolutely.
style questions?
Both. So you have a section which will be comprehension, and they will ask you what is happening, why did he do this, or who does he meet when he arrives there, that sort of question. But then you will have a passage, and they will ask you, how does the author make this passage vivid, or how does the author make this a compelling speech, or how are we made to feel sympathy for the hero, for example.
Yeah, so it's proper English language, English literature kind of techniques there.
And you answer in English and need to lift quotes, and you used exactly the same structure as you would do in an English exam with your peel or peer, depending who your teacher is, as a point evaluation.
Having done history with both my children, I come out in a slight rash when I hear the acronym PEE. I actually changed mine. I changed it in our family to APE because it enabled me to exactly the same things, but I just gave it a different acronym because it enabled me to make worksheets with lots of apes on, which made me happy.
Well, that
what are you going to put orange peels down?
I'm impressed about that.
Lame,
yeah.
So when it comes to the Latin exam, because I get asked this quite a lot by parents, is it a lot of writing, and are there questions that are very high marks? So for example, in history, there's sometimes like 15-mark questions and things like that. Is it the same kind of thing where you have big solid essay style questions, or is it more is there any multiple choice, for example? Because I know AQA loves a bit of multiple choice.
With OCR, there are some 1-marker, 2-marker questions, quite a few of them. And then the translation is a longer chunk, but really a translation is made out of different sentences that are eventually made out of words. So that's not the problem. I think the only essay style one that you find is in the literature ones. But for those, they don't ask you to talk about a passage in Latin. They ask you about the totality of the texts that you have read. Like, for example, Virgil offers a pessimistic approach to war in book 12. How far do you agree with this statement?
And you'd answer in English, but
yes.
put quotes in Latin.
No. You don't even need to quote. Where they don't give you the text, you don't need to quote.
So could
you can use your own words. Yes, you write in English.
But could you have read it in English?
For that 10-marker,
and
you could have read it in English and write in English.
That's cheating though, right?
Is it though? Because if you have read in English, I'm not sure you will be able to explain very well the effect that it has on the audience, because you want to compare as well. You may argue in your answer, well, for a modern audience, this text would be really boring. For an ancient audience, however, it would provide something that we nowadays get through cinema or through other experience. But it's a point of view. Yeah, I'm not saying that's one of the answers, but
because I'm guessing as well it's about word choice and vocabulary, and you can't really refer to that if you've read it in the English.
No,
you'd be like, here he uses the word drizzle. It's like, no, he really doesn't use the word drizzle.
Exactly. We have a lot of problems with that. That comes up quite a lot. There's lots of commas. No. But yeah, it's a small question, and most students really enjoy it. It comes towards the end of the paper, and they're ready to write about it. They have plenty of other opportunities to show that they understand the text in Latin.
Is it 2 papers for most of the exam boards? I'm guessing it is.
So you have a paper for the language, And that includes the comprehension and the translation. And then you have another paper for the verse and another paper for the prose.
Oh, so it's 3 written papers.
Yes. And some people choose to do a classical studies component, but I don't do that because I like to focus on the language exclusively. But
So
there
the
is also an
classical
option
one-
to look at other sources.
So the classical one would be instead of another of the units. It wouldn't be on top of it.
Yes, instead of the verse, for example.
Okay, so Latin sounds a lot of fun, which is starkly different.
I don't
to how
hear
I
that
remember it.
all the time from people I don't know. So I'm glad you're already there. We've reached that point in the conversation.
Well, Mrs. Evans, my Latin teacher from school, would be amazed to hear me say that, because my experience of Latin at school was a lot of vocabulary testing. Actually, that was my experience of French. So maybe that was just language learning, which has changed a lot, hasn't it, recently?
It has changed a lot because you can learn the vocabulary by just sitting there, putting your elbows on the table and repeating and writing many times, which it's part of the learning, but that's not the only way to learn. You can also learn by reading lovely stories, by talking about a text that you have just read in the language, and then you're using those words actively. You're much more likely to remember them without the suffering.
So Latin has the benefit of having the same alphabet that we use. Greek, not so much. So
it's not a difference.
You don't find it a challenge?
No, it's not a challenge at all. It's not like Mandarin. I have studied Mandarin myself, and you have to learn a very large amount of new signs, symbols. I don't even know how to strokes and the order, how you write. Everything is very different. Greek is an alphabet. Once you've learned the letters, you're good to go. You can be writing and reading in Greek in less than a week, in like 2-3 lessons.
Actually,
then you get used to it very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, one summer school, when they were younger, I would give them options of things they could study during summer, and they wanted to learn ancient Greek, as homeschooled children do. And I got them a book which was like a ancient Greek detectives book. They knew the Greek letters really within a week, like you said.
Was it the one with the batrachos, the frog?
You're testing me. It was brown and it had a microscope, kind of, not a microscope, like a magnifying glass on the front. I'll tell you what, anyone listening,
the one I used.
I don't think there's a lot of them, to be I don't think there's a plethora of detective-style ancient Greek questions.
Batrachos one, where this frog needs to find out about his ancestor, needs to learn Greek in order to be able to read the letter.
That sounds familiar, and I'm a big fan of frogs, so I can see why that might have happened. But it's a really fun one.
Yes.
Well, it's that sense of ciphers and coding again, isn't it? It's the sense of a secret language. So talk to me then about Greek. How is Greek different to Latin when it comes to learning it, or is the process similar?
Very similar. It's pretty much the same thing.
I'm guessing there's not a Facebook group of people chatting in ancient Greek to each other.
Well, let me break the news to you. There is. In fact, very recently, my spoken ancient Greek is not as good as my spoken Latin. So I myself joined a course with a specialist, and we would meet every Sunday evening to speak ancient Greek for an hour. We would read a text and then just talk about it in Greek. So it does happen. Yes, we're speaking. Somebody somewhere is doing this now.
So
universities as well are pretty much on board with this. For example, in Jesus College in Oxford, they do plenty of spoken Latin. It's also happening in the States. It's a movement. I was going
to ask you that, actually. I was going to ask whether you think that the exam boards eventually will move towards adding a spoken and listening component to Latin.
I think the examining boards have other more important jobs to do before they do that. As much as I love having some Latin, I think they first need to look at the authors that they include and the topics in the texts. That's the first change that needs to take place. I know that's not what you asked me, but I'm going to take the opportunity. There's bigger problems. I think that needs to be sorted first. And I'm not opposed to assessing the progress in Latin, but I think the focus on accuracy is maybe a bit misplaced. So I would change that before I introduce a spoken element. I think that's maybe going too far too quickly is not necessary. Smaller changes might be better. And I'm sure things are going in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the examples is that they go at a glacial speed, don't they? So it takes a long time to filter through.
But they have to. They can't really just jump into any new trend and then notice, oh, we had not noticed that's not very good. Let's go back. In a way, it's fine.
They could do. They could do. So let's cycle back to ancient Greek, because I have this adorable idea in my mind of you sitting in your London garden chatting away in ancient Greek to somebody, and your neighbours looking over the fence going, what is going on in there? So does ancient Greek sound different to modern Greek?
It doesn't sound that different to modern Greek. Again, we have a reconstructed classical pronunciation, like with Latin. We were talking about that earlier. You were saying, like, how do we know? We have the Latin from the church, then we have modern Italian, and then we have what we think the Romans sounded like. And we have a reconstruction of that. And that's what we use. And it's a convention. We could use something else, but that's what we use. It's the same with Greek. There are a few more disagreements, I would say, in the world of Greek speaking. For example, I am from Spain, and we are quite adamant that certain sounds should be pronounced in a certain way. And then in England, there's a tendency to pronounce them in a different way. And then come the Greeks, it's like, we don't mind anything that you have studied. We speak it. You're not going to tell us how to pronounce it. It's the same a little bit with Latin. The Italians have a different way to pronounce it, which is not what we think is the reconstructed form of the Latin, but they're saying, now you're going to tell us we've been doing it wrong for 2,000 years now. So, yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because part of me thinks that the community of speakers that is closest sort of historically to the original language ought to get a veto. They ought to be like, you know what, this is how we're going to be saying it, because we're the inheritors almost of the culture.
Well, they still do what they want. Yeah, there is a sense of that. Like, definitely, the Vatican is now not going to. There's not going to turn around and say, like, we're going to change our pronunciation because we've done studies, and yes, Cicero must have sounded different, because it's unimportant. Latin doesn't belong to the 1st century BC, and I think that's one of the areas, talking about the examining boards, it's one of the areas that needs to be addressed. Partly the reason why people think that Latin is not appealing or is dead or has no use is that because constantly we're working on texts from the classical times, but Latin has been used very actively in Europe and the world until not too long ago. So science, well into the 18th century, was all done in Latin. We have literature written in Latin throughout the Middle Ages and well into the modern age. So you can't really claim that there's a right Latin way, a right way of pronouncing Latin, because the pronunciation of Latin changes across time and throughout the territory. And that's fine. It's a language, it's a life. You wouldn't say that somebody from India speaks wrong English because they speak it with a different accent than the accent a person from London would have.
You say that when you're talking about texts, because I know that some of the J.K. Rowling Harry Potters are translated into Latin or Greek, one or other of them.
Both.
Oh, really? Wow, amazing.
Yes.
So
Tolkien as well. There's we have
into what? Sorry,
Tolkien as well has.
His works have been translated. Okay,
into Latin. Yeah.
Is there a sort of argument to say let's have some of these texts in the exam as well, modern stories, or would that not work so much because they're translations?
That's a good question. I think they would work if they are well written. Not all the translations that are published are well written, or I like them, other people might like them. But why would we do that? Why would we do that when we can be accessing the thoughts, the ideas, and getting into conversation with people in the 16th century, with people in the 9th century, in the 12th century? Why would we want to reread Tolkien, which we can... Oops, sorry, my microphone got too excited with this, which we could be reading in English anyway.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
In the original version.
It's equivalent of sort of sitting a Spanish exam and reading, instead of reading the guy who wrote Gabriel Garcia Gabriel Garcia, the guy who wrote
Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Yes.
Perfect. Yes. Although, was he South American or Spanish? Now I'm confused.
Colombian.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay. Well, scrap that. Let's go for a Spanish poet. It would be equivalent of instead.
It doesn't matter. He's Spanish.
Okay.
I like the Spanish speaking poet. Or author. Let's say author.
Instead of having something like that where you're accessing the text in the original language, it would be equivalent of having T.S. Eliot translated into Spanish and then studying that for Spanish.
Yeah,
that would be
make
weird,
sense.
wouldn't it?
Yeah,
you're right.
Weird.
Okay, in that case, if any exam board is listening, don't put J.K. Rowling in the exams because that's just odd. Okay, so scrap that idea. I've got lots of other good ideas, though. Come to me for the other ones.
Let's be very careful with this because you never know when people might quit the podcast and say, oh, I heard people talking about. No, it's not a good idea.
The chance of the exam board listening to my podcast after the things I've said about them, yeah, that's never going to happen. But anyway, we're cycling away from Greek again. So back to Greek. So you teach Greek in exactly the same way that you teach Latin. So there's a certain amount of speaking and listening and fun. But the exam, I'm guessing, how does the exam work? Is it the same as the Latin exam? Same kind of format, same exam boards? How does that work?
It used to be. We used to do the OCR one. There's only OCR for that one. But now there is a new kid on the blog, and I'm very excited that you're asking me about it because we have the intermediate certificate in Greek, which is equivalent to half a GCSE and covers the grammar of the first half, but does not require you to do the literature. And they've made it very accessible. You can see it pretty much anywhere. You don't even need to be in a school. It costs £15. You can receipt it again the following year if you think you didn't do as well as you wanted. And it's a pleasure to study because you have quality time to spend and you don't need to worry about a very difficult honours exam at the end.
And who runs that?
That is run by, is it? I know it's the Classics for All is behind it. Yes, the Classic Association and Classics for All. And they award it themselves. So it's the intermediate certificate in classical Greek.
Okay, so it's not like a BTEC or NCFE or any of those
separate
things.
One.
How is it different to a GCSE, for example? What are the things that aren't in it and what are the things that are extra in it?
So you don't do the literature. You only do the language. And something that I really like is that there's quite a lot of composition in Greek. So there's quite a lot of English to Greek, which gives you an invitation to do more writing in Greek during lesson time and spend more time focusing on that. They're quite open as well with the translations that they will accept, and the vocabulary list is very manageable.
Yeah, now that's what I was going to ask you actually, because obviously my perception as sort of when I started this segment was that Greek is harder because it's got a different alphabet, and I wondered whether that is reflected in the exam in as much as it's slightly easier texts or slightly easier just because they take account of the fact that you've had to learn a new alphabet.
No, absolutely. Like for the GCSE exam, the standard one, there's no difference. In fact, it could be argued that the Greek one is a bit more difficult because people generally have less time to get ready for it. And the outcome is pretty much the same as the Latin one. For the intermediate certificate, it is a bit different because obviously it's half a GCSE, so you have a shorter vocabulary and less grammar to learn. But it's not to account for the writing. Believe me, you write the writing very quickly.
Damn, I was hoping it might be a nice, easy GCSE, thing. But no.
No.
So when it comes to the GCSEs, I know that a lot of private schools do Latin and some private schools do Greek because it's just a thing. It's a tradition. They like to put it on the curriculum so that posh parents are like, look, my child knows Latin. Right. So that's a very mean view, but that is
it is a very mean view. I was thinking like, well, no,
it's a home education podcast. I can get away with it.
They put it in the syllabus because they can, and it's useful, even though people might argue something else. I thought we were going to get to the point where you asked me about the utility.
That's exactly where I was going. So why would a home educating family, for example, choose Latin or Greek? Would it be with an eye to a degree, like something like if they wanted to do classics or even something like ancient history? Or is there something integral within the subjects that makes them useful?
I think there isn't one single answer for this question. It will depend on the student. For some students, it will be an integral part of their education and the worldview. For others, they may prefer to do another language to this level of depth and analysis and knowing the literature. I'm not going to argue that Latin is superior to, say, doing German. I am going to say, however, that when you do the Latin GCSE, you are doing literature at a level that you're not doing it with your German exam. But it's definitely a choice to do with the interests of the student.
Is it linguistically helpful? If, for example, my daughter decided to do Latin and Greek, would it then help her when she's 45 and decides to have a midlife crisis and backpack around the world, and she wants to then, I don't know, she's like in a coffee shop in Verona? Would it be helpful in that circumstance?
Look, I am a Latin tutor. I make my living out of teaching Latin.
And you're going to turn around and go, no, it's totally useless.
Well, I could be saying to you, absolutely, it just does wonders to the structure of your brain. I don't believe any of that. Languages are languages. Her analytical skills are going to improve if she does Latin, and they're going to improve if she does Mandarin, and they're going to improve if she does Arabic. I don't think there's anything superior about Latin. She could do any other language and then spend time studying linguistics and grammar, which is what we do when we study Latin, and achieve exactly the same effect. So my answer is no. Will it be easier to learn Italian if you know Latin? Of course. But it will also be easier to learn Italian if you've learned Spanish, because they're very similar languages, not because there's any natural superiority in the structure of the Latin language. It's a language like any other. What it has is the tradition and the wealth of texts that had been written in it, and the use that the words have taken later on in other languages. Yeah, but there's nothing in Latin learning the structure of language that's going to make you superior in any way. You may as well be doing
I feel like lots of Latin scholars should listen to this, because I think.
But no, I don't want them to listen. They might be angry with me. Not everyone agrees with this point of view. Often it's used as a selling point for Latin and Greek that it will make you have better, I don't know, problem-solving skills and make you better at maths. It will make you better at German. And I think, well, but if you want to learn German, then learn German. It's like a really roundabout way to learn your German. To do 3 years of Latin if you don't like it, so that then German will be easier afterwards. Doesn't make a lot of sense. You may as well just do German. And perhaps when you pick up Latin afterwards, it will be easier because you've done German.
I mean, when I moved to Spain briefly last year, I learned Spanish, and I also know French, and I spent my entire life switching from one to another without meaning to. I was like a train that is constantly crossing the tracks. I ended up speaking a kind of, people talk about franglais, which is like French and English. Yeah. I ended up speaking the kind of Frespagna.
But that's fine. That's fine. As long as you can communicate. If you had spent there longer, it's fine.
So my last question to you is, English, Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, German, I'm guessing a bit of Italian, and a bit of Mandarin, and I suspect there's some more going on in there because you're a bit of a polyglot, right? So
Arabic. I studied Arabic.
I studied Arabic and loved Arabic.
It's all a bit rusty, but obviously I can still read a bit, but it's a bit rusty. It was a long time ago. But I've studied many languages. Not all of them I've kept. So over time, quite a few dead ones as well. So I've done Hittite and I have done Sanskrit as well in the past. They're not languages that I keep alive at the moment, but I studied them because I was interested in their history and their structure and the texts written in them.
I had another lovely visual image of you settling down for the evening in your armchair and getting out a papyrus tablet and a bit of clay, and just perusing a bit of Hittite. Anyway. So you know a lot of languages, and I have my last question to you is, a trick question, kind of. What is the easiest language to learn? Do you think? You're going to say they're all easy and they're all hard, but I want to know,
Yes.
What's the easiest one, do you think?
I think for every person, there will be a different easiest language depending on what their first language is. So the easiest language to learn will be the closest to your mother tongue.
If you're English, then?
I don't know. I am not English, but I would say if I was English, potentially Dutch. And interestingly, for English people, from the point of view of vocabulary, French. Now, they are not that close in terms of the typology, but they are quite close in terms of where the vocabulary of English comes from. So you have a lot of understanding there just from knowing words, because they've moved on to English and they're part of English now.
That's so true. A lot of our vocabulary has come from France, and actually living here in South Wales, Welsh is very similar to French as well. It's considerably harder, but it has like a lot of similarities. I think because there was trade routes or something. Don't ask me, I'm not great with languages, but I can safely say that if you're English, Welsh is not a naturally easy language.
Well, no, because it's a Celtic language. But if you're Welsh and then you want to learn Irish, then things are easier. Yeah.
So for you, what was the easiest language you learned?
For me, the language I've picked up with the least effort has been Italian. I've never done a lesson in Italian in my life, but I can read books and I go to Italy and I talk to people because it's so similar to Catalan and Spanish.
There's a big crossover, isn't there?
There's a big crossover.
I was surprised when I went to Portugal how little crossover there was between Portuguese and Spanish.
There is, once you get used to the pronunciation differences, and once you get used to the equivalences, like when you have this sound in Spanish, you generally have this one in Portuguese, then you start seeing through the apparent differences and you see the similarities underneath.
You're right. A lot of it is the pronunciation. And as somebody who learned a lot of French when I was young, I really struggled with Spanish until my Spanish tutor said, just pronounce everything. And I'm like,
yes, just say makes a lot of sense every letter. Because it's a very really transparent language as well. It's like Latin and Greek, I have to say, in that sense, because the language has, the way we write the language reflects the way we speak the language. So you don't have to do the double job that you have, for example, in French, where you need to learn letter combinations to create different sounds. So
it's more straightforward in that way, I think, isn't it?
Indeed.
So for anyone who's listening, who is now thinking, oh my God, I so want to learn Latin and join a little Facebook group and chat in Latin. And I want to also learn ancient Greek so that my child can natter away in ancient Greek to his neighbour. So, and I'm sure there will be people out there, because it can't just be me who has this reaction, surely.
I think there are lots of people, yes.
I think there are too, right?
Particularly ancient Greek, I think. It's very appealing. It's very appealing. And then you're learning a different alphabet as well. When you go to Greece today, you can easily move around. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there's something very cool about being able to talk in ancient Greek. I mean, that is the height of cool. In actual fact, talking in Hittite perhaps trumps it, but I'm guessing that's not a thing.
Well, I would really say it's not a thing, but who knows? It wasn't a thing when I was studying Hittite. Certainly not. We were reading the tablets, and that's where it ended. But I know that there's a bit of a sin with Middle Egyptian, for example. So it's just the new way of learning languages. People have realized you acquire the language faster. You're able to read complex texts with more ease if you're able to speak the language. And so why not use it as a tool? Obviously, you're not going to go around talking to Hittite warriors, but it's going to help you read the texts.
It might get you out of some tricky situations if they invent time travel, however. But on that note,
Absolutely.
On that completely mad note, do tell our listeners where they can find you, where they can read about your services, I don't know, follow you on social media, all that kind of jazz.
Yeah, I can give you the links later on to put on the website, but mostly I can be found on my website, which is www.latintutoronline.com.
That's a good website address.
I quite like it, yes.
There clearly aren't many Latin tutors if you manage to nab that one.
Yeah, there are a few, but they have permutations of the same name as me, but mine is really good, I would say.
I like that.
So they can find me there. If they write Anna Martin Latin, I come up quite quickly in any search.
And that's Anna with one N.
Anna with one N, yeah, Anna Martin. Yeah. I also have an Instagram account. That's the Latin Tutor Online. And I have a YouTube channel, which I'm working on at the moment. I was initially putting a lot of videos up there, and then I've had a bit of a lull. And this summer, now that my exam students are gone, I will be putting more materials. The plan is from September to start doing more group lessons. So particularly, I want to do different groups for the intermediate Greek certificate, and also for the Key Stage 3 Latin for pre-GCSE. Latin.
Well, I'm off to follow you on Instagram to see whether you post photos of yourself settling down with a Mesopotamian tablet in your arms.
Well, I think you'll find lots of pictures of bread and things like that in my Instagram, because I like experimental archaeology. So now that the summer is coming, I'm going to start cooking again. I have my books ready. So I do lots of Roman cooking. I have a bit of it in my blog as well, as a way of bringing the past back to life.
So you use old recipes and recreate them?
Yes, yes. So you can read the recipe in Latin and then reduce the amount of pepper dramatically, because otherwise you can't eat it, and the fish sauce, and then adapt it for the little ones in the house. It's actually lots of fun. I did 2 years ago. Was it 2 summers ago? I think so, yeah. I think it was the pandemic summer. We were a lot at home, and I decided to have my whole family eating only the foods that the Romans would have eaten when they were in Britain. So we weren't allowed potatoes or tomatoes or corn or anything like that. And I was putting fish sauce everywhere. Well, some of the spices made it through the spice route. So you would be surprised. Some of the Roman food tastes quite a bit like Indian food.
I'm surprised that pepper was there, because I thought the whole pepper route came later.
Oh, no, the Romans had the pepper coming from the East, and they paid a lot of money for it. And in fact, we don't know if these recipes we have had really so much pepper in it, or if people were being posh and showing off and saying, put all this pepper, let's be rich and happy and show off with our recipes.
So it's a bit like Nigella Lawson, where she used to be like, and obviously you'd put a quail egg on the top of this, and you'd like, would I really though? Would I put like 500 quail eggs on my omelette? I don't think so.
Don't think so. Exactly. Yeah, but it's the same thing. You need to read it with a pinch of salt.
I love the cooking metaphor at the end. Very nice. Well, thank you so much, Anna. That was a really fun podcast. And I honestly am so intrigued now by all these mental images I have of these people chatting away in Latin and stuff. It sounds fabulous. So thank you so much for coming on today. It was a real pleasure meeting you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. It was a pleasure as well. I really enjoyed myself.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's Home Education Matters podcast. See you at the next one. Have a lovely day.